acknowledge the traditional custodians of the ground we stand on, and thank them for allowing Papa to tell stories on these glorious lands we share.
In this episode of 3 Food Memories, you'll meet the world's most perfect pancake maker, who also happens to be an Emmy Award-winning journalist. His reporting has taken him from war zones to dinner tables across the globe. A fearless frontline correspondent for PBS and Vice News, he's not only investigating some of the world's toughest stories, he's also been investigated himself, read, abducted and tortured. Yet, he still keeps reporting. For over 2 decades, he's uncovered powerful stories from child labour in Uzbekistan, North Korean workers in Russian labour camps, to pro-Russian militia in Ukraine. Despite the intensity of his work, he carries a thoughtful demeanour that puts people at ease, with just enough dry wit to keep you guessing. Simon, welcome to 3 Food Memories.
Thank you. I love that introduction. I had no idea I was an award-winning pancake maker.
In the introduction, I spoke of an abduction. In 2014, you were abducted while reporting in the Ukraine. What happened?
Well, let's get right into it, okay? Let's dive in. No pillow talk. So... I was covering Ukraine for Vice News. It was an organization that had only just started to exist. This was actually the first story that we were doing because Vice had been doing great online documentaries that they were known for, and they decided that they wanted to dive into news so that they could compete with the big guys like CNN and the BBC. And that's why they hired me, because I had already been a news reporter who'd done a lot of work for big outfits like that. And going to Vice was a completely different kettle of fish to working for any of the traditional media organizations. And so we were really sort of nitty-gritty and on the ground and kind of trying to show the viewer what it was like to be there, rather than just trying to tell them what was happening.
You're a young journalist at the time, weren't you?
Oh, yeah, I mean, youngish. I think I was 33 or thereabouts. I'm 44 now, so this was 10 years ago.
And brave.
11 years ago. I mean, or stupid, depending on how you look at it. I mean, the older I get, the more I lean towards the stupid end of the spectrum, looking back. But the issue was, and I think the reason our reporting was so compelling was that we didn't do voiceovers. We used subtitles so that people could speak in their own voice, and so that the viewer could, see the intonation and inflection of the person speaking. And we allowed a lot of our characters to speak for themselves. The drawback of that was that everybody in Eastern Ukraine could pretty much understand our stories, because most of it was interviews in the Russian language that the locals could understand. So there were a lot of locals who were not happy with my reporting, and they may not have been happy with CNN's reporting either, but they couldn't understand it because it was all translated. And so I kind of had a reputation in the area that I was covering, which for a foreign correspondent is actually kind of unusual. I mean, usually the people don't know the foreign reporters that are reporting on their local news issues, conflicts, what have you, because it's usually in a different language and it's broadcast in a different country. But, this was YouTube, and anybody could access it, and they could understand 70% of it because only my stand-ups were my pieces to camera were in English. And so the local pro-Russia forces in a town called Slavyansk knew who I was. I was notorious, and they had issued orders, I guess, to shut me down, was the idea. And we were traveling back from a neighboring town, and at this time, the pro-Russia forces and the Russian forces that were operating undercover had set up checkpoints all over the region. And this is eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, which is the focus of a lot of the fighting in Ukraine to this day. And there was this last checkpoint that was literally 5 minutes away from the place where we were staying. And we thought we were home free because we'd gone through 3 or 4, and each one was kind of a dicey proposition. And this young guy with a AK shines a flashlight into my face, and I'm driving. And, there's 4 other journalists in the car with me. And he starts going, "This is the guy. This is the guy." And he gets this printout out of his pocket, and he unfolds it, and it's a picture of me. And he's like, "Yeah, this is the guy." And they pull me out of the car. They pull all of us out of the car, and they stand us in front of the headlights of the car. This is nighttime, so it's kind of eerie and scary. And they separate me from the rest of the people in the car, and they lead me off to a Volga sedan, and they drive me away, and they leave the other guys behind.
What's going through your head at this time?
I was terrified. I mean, I'm wondering what it's about, and I'm not expecting the worst at this point because I've just been, bundled into a car, but I don't know where I'm going. But when I got to where I was going, that's when I knew it was bad, because they took us to the headquarters that the pro-Russia forces had set up for themselves, that they took over. It was a Ukrainian secret police office for the area, kind of like the FBI here, and they turned it into their headquarters. And I had been there the day before because they had regularly issued these kinds of press gatherings there where they would bring people together. And they had displayed a dead body in front of the building of a person that they'd executed a couple of days prior. And so when they brought me into this building where I knew that they were holding a lot of other people hostage, some of whom they'd killed, that's when I knew I was in for a bad time. And, things only got worse from there. I mean, they really roughed me up pretty good. And, there was a mock execution, and I was, blindfolded the whole time, and they threatened to kill me. And there were a lot of other people in there who weren't having a very good time either. And you could kind of hear the screams of other people that they were torturing and beating up the entire time I was there. And this is on top of the fact that there was an open conflict happening in the area. So, you could hear the artillery fire and the gunshots from the cellar that I was being held in, which certainly didn't add to the feeling of being secure or safe, because every time the fighting would tick up, the fighters would come back to the space, and they'd be very angry because maybe they'd lost somebody on the battlefield, or somebody got hurt, or they were scared, and they would take it out on the prisoners. So it was, I mean, without exaggerating, it was definitely the 3 worst days of my entire life, for sure.
And Simon, what did you hold on to? What kept you alive and thinking, I've just got to get out of this place?
It was a long time ago, but looking back, it's hard to describe what it feels like to not know what's going on, and to wonder if anybody your friends, your family, even knows that you've been kidnapped, or whether they're looking for you, or whether they are at all care about your fate. And this is what's, I think, going through the mind of anybody who's been taken hostage and put incommunicado in that way. And I was blindfolded, so I really didn't know what was going on. But this is what I was thinking about all of the time. And after leaving me like that for, I don't know, a day or a day and a half, I mean, blindfolded and tied up, they put me in a room with other people, and just being in a room with other people and knowing that those guys had been there longer than I had, and that they were still alive, kind of made me feel better. And I don't want to exaggerate because like it was really bad. Don't get me wrong, but it was only 3 days. And some of the people who were there had been there for weeks already by the time I'd been brought into this cellar, and would spend weeks more until the town was liberated after I was released. And so I didn't really go through all the stages of, the psychological stages of, I was kind of mostly in shell shock. And then brought into a room with a bunch of other people and trying to figure out what the situation was there. And then I was released. It felt like a long time, but it also happened pretty quickly.
And this didn't stop you from reporting. In fact, it seemed to have given you more energy and determination to keep going, to keep reporting, to keep telling the story. How come?
Well, I always felt a big responsibility towards reporting on what was happening in Ukraine because I'd been reporting on the former Soviet Union for a long time. And my background is Russian. I'm from Russia. I grew up in the States, came here when I was 1 year old, but I grew up in a Russian-speaking household. And so I'd been to Ukraine before, and I had a very clear sense of what Russia was doing to Ukraine was incredibly wrong, and that I had to make sure that the world knew about it. Because, it'd be one thing if it was clear-cut, black and white, everybody was on the same page about what was happening. But the Russians were throwing so much disinformation into the fray and lying about their involvement so at such a scale that it kind of wound you up. It made you even angrier than you would have been if it was just happening and they weren't lying about what they were doing. And so, I know what's happening. I know that there's like a lot of people out there who aren't following very closely that are like, well, on the one hand, Ukraine is a basket case. And on the other hand, hasn't NATO been expanding? And so it's kind of like the Ukrainians' own fault. They brought it on themselves. And I know that that's not true. But I hear these narratives being parroted by people who are just, taking hook, line, and sinker what the Russians are saying. And it just like winds me up because I know that's not the case. And so I just had this really, powerful sense that if I wasn't going to set things straight, set the record straight, go there, witness it, see it, report it, then the truth just might be lost. And the Russian narrative was going to be allowed to march on, and it would lead to successive countries falling to Russia's new imperial plans. And, maybe I didn't think it through that far, but I knew that there was a lie, and it was playing out in front of my face. And there's nothing like a lie being spread, obviously right in front of your nose, that's going to encourage a journalist to start digging even deeper.
Truth is very important to you, Simon. What do you get from food? What is the truth that you get from what you eat?
Well, I think I wrote to you guys that from a young age, I had a passion for I'll call it a South or a Mediterranean pastry called a Burek, or at least that's what it was introduced to me as for the first time when I was a kid, living in Yugoslavia at 8 and 9 years old. And it's this wonderful kind of phyllo pastry that's about this big, that's filled with cheese, and it's just like one of the best tasting things in the world. And at the time when I was a kid, I thought it was a local Yugoslav dish, which it is. They have it in Croatia and in Bosnia and in Serbia. But I didn't know that so many countries around the Mediterranean had their own version of this thing. And for me, that dish and kind of learning about how it was interpreted around the region kind of inspired my interest in Southeastern Europe in general, and kind of sparked my obsession with Eastern European and Cold War era politics, which I draw a straight line
I was going to
between
say
that.
how.
I draw a straight line between that and my obsession with Eastern European politics today.
So how does let's take us on that little journey. Just take us on a quick trip. How do you go from Burek to Eastern European politics?
So basically, I mean, I started reading about Turkish history and Balkan history specifically. You know, the war in the Balkans started after I'd left. I was there in 1989. My mother was there researching her dissertation, and we left just in time. And so, you know, Yugoslavia was in the news. The war in Bosnia was in the news. And I was just like pouring through these books about Bosnia and Kosovo, and just becoming, you know, more and more ingrained in the political struggle of the region. And as a teenager later on, I really regretted that I hadn't been old enough to be a journalist to cover those conflicts, because I read so many different journalists' accounts of them that I was kind of inspired to become a journalist. And I thought, well, I'll never see anything like that in my time. I've completely missed the boat. But boy, was I wrong. I've certainly had my fair share of conflict in my lifetime, and it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. It seems to like it's only going to get worse before it gets better. But the 90s, you know, especially the late 90s, when I was in high school, it seemed like America had just ushered a new era of peace upon the world, and everything was going to be boring from here on out. Things didn't go that way.
Boring as in nothing to report on.
Exactly. Boring as in peaceful. And just, you know, the political system that won the Cold War was going to be the one that was going to be accepted by everyone around the world, and there was no going back, is what it seemed like. And now we see that there are all these, you know, recalcitrant regimes, Russia top among them, that are trying to claw back some of their past glory, and very violently.
How are your parents involved in politics?
My parents are involved insofar as they left the Soviet Union because they were dissidents. Specifically, my dad was a dissident. He was what they called a refusenik. I don't know if you're familiar with that descriptor, but refuseniks were people in the Soviet Union who weren't happy with life in the Soviet Union, asked to be allowed to leave the Soviet Union, and by dint of asking to leave, exposed themselves as being opponents of the Soviet Union. And if they weren't allowed to leave, because you couldn't just leave the Soviet Union, you had to get what was called an exit visa, then you were deemed a refusenik because you were refused exit. But it had a whole bunch of other consequences tied into it because, like I said, you'd exposed yourself as being opposed to the regime, because why would you want to leave this Soviet socialist paradise when everybody knows that the rest of the world was so much well off, and in capitalism, everybody is so poor and has nothing to eat? You must be crazy and, you know, a traitor to want to leave the Soviet Union. And so not only weren't you allowed to leave, but you also couldn't hold a job. You couldn't get support from the state, and you couldn't participate in any kind of, you know, official social or, you know, education or any other kind of thing that was arbitrated by the state, which under the Soviet Union was pretty much everything. So you know, became an outcast. And as an outcast, with not much else to do, because, again, he couldn't go to work, my dad ended up participating, like joining up with other dissidents and participating in various, you know, protests and underground meetings and art exhibitions that were not state sanctioned, and ended up with a KGB tail that followed him around pretty much all of the time. until 1982. So he became a refusnik in 1978 or 1979, and he was finally issued his exit visa in 1982. And I was born in the previous year, so we left the country then. There was like this mini thaw in relations between the West, but actually a lot of it had to do with the fact that there was this law in the United States that said that trade relations with the Soviet Union would be based on their human rights record. And one of the ways they used to measure the situation with human rights in the Soviet Union was by how the Jews were being treated. And we were a Jewish family. So when Jews would be allowed to leave the Soviet Union, that ticked a box in the United States. And so every once in a while, the Soviet Union would essentially trade their Jews for grain or something like that they needed from the West, because the trade, like I said, was contingent on the human rights record.
You left Russia when you at the age of 1. What stories were your parents telling you as you started to understand of Russia?
Well, I got a very different perspective on the country from each of my parents. You know, my father was the one who motivated the escape from the Soviet Union. He was the one who was unhappy with life there. And my mother always had an affinity for Russian culture and Russian language and literature. And she was a Slavic linguist. And, well, the reason that we ended up in Yugoslavia was because it was the closest we could get to the Soviet Union at that time without being in the Soviet Union, because Yugoslavia was a socialist country that was neither in the Warsaw Pact and, you know, not one of the Western countries either. And so it was kind of neutral in a way. And so we went there so that she could do her Slavic language studies. So, you know, I had a real appreciation for the history and for the culture and the language from my mother, but a really realistic perspective on the authoritarian regime and the politics and the harshness and, you know, the system of gulag prisons that dissidents were thrown in from my father. So I think I had a pretty realistic view of what the Soviet Union was all about.
Was it a bittersweet feeling? On one hand, there was this rich culture that your mother would romanticize about and celebrate, and then you've got Dad saying, actually, you know what? This is not how I feel it. This is not what's running through my veins. So where did you land in that flavor palette?
Well, you know, my views of Russia have changed with Russia. Russia certainly isn't static, and it's changing all of the time. And for the last, 20 odd years, it's only been getting worse. And so my view of Russia as a country has also slid downhill as Russia has gotten worse. So, when I returned to Russia in the late 90s, in 1998, I went back to Russia to go to university. I didn't realize it at the time that I was visiting in a very fleeting moment of freedom when Russia was probably at its most liberal and its most free in its potentially entire 1,000-year history. And that moment passed very quickly. But when you're 17, 18, 19, those years seem like a really long time, and they're a formative part of your life. And so, I was cooked in those years. That was the period that made me who I am today. And it was a wild time in Russia. It was a somewhat lawless time in Russia, but it was a time when you could do anything. And it seemed like there was only possibilities beyond the horizon. It was an amazing time to be there, which is why it's so sad looking at what it's become today, where in a lot of ways it's become even more repressive than it was under the Soviet Union. And it's crazy that it's only been, 25 years, 25, 30 years since I arrived. But we went back to Russia as a family when I was 17 because, like I said, my mom, she'd never actually wanted to leave. So when she found an opportunity to go back there with a good employment situation, she took it. So my mom and my stepdad were put in charge of a student exchange program for American students coming to Russia to learn the language. And because they had been teaching Russian as professors in various universities in the United States, they were perfectly suited to handle these kids. And so they were put in charge of this program called CIEE that would bring students to Russia to learn Russian and get American college credit, so it would work towards their graduation goals back home. So it was a good program for the students, but it meant that my parents were leaving the year before I graduated high school. And so I hadn't applied to universities in the United States yet. And they just figured the easiest thing would be to bring me with them. And I ended up going to college over there and dropping out 2.5 years later because I was really unprepared for the Russian education system, which was nothing like the education system here.
Your second food memory takes us to your rookie reporting years at the Moscow Times. Tell me about that. Do you want a reminder?
Yeah, can you tell me about that?
The Welsh roommate taught you to make the humble Italian red sauce.
Oh, right. Yeah, Oliver. When I moved to Moscow, I had been fired from my first newspaper job at the St. Petersburg Times for laziness. I mean, that's not what they said, but they said, we're going to put you on a freelance basis because we think that maybe will encourage you more. To do works was in parenthesis. And I'd also been kicked out of university because I'd stopped going to class for the job that I wasn't doing so well at the St. Petersburg Times. So I kind of came to Moscow with my tail between my legs. And I left my parents behind, I left my dorm behind, and all of the things that sort of, I'd go to my mom's house to do my laundry, and there was a cafeteria at the dormitory. And pretty much, up to that point, everything had been taken care of for me. And suddenly I was in Moscow in the big bad city, and I had to fend for myself. And I spent a year there living on my own, surviving on shawarmas and such. And then I moved in with my former roommate from St. Petersburg. Well, he was more a dorm mate. This Welsh guy, Oliver Bullough, who had gotten a job with Reuters. And Reuters supplied him with a really nice apartment. And I was like, yeah, I want to live there. I want to be roommates with this guy. Like he had the expat, setup. And I had to pay a small fraction of the rent because most of it was covered by the company. But, I had to start cooking for myself. And I think Oliver was starting to get tired of the fact that he was doing all the cooking. So he took it upon himself to teach me how to make a very simple Italian pasta sauce, which became the basis for most of my cooking probably for the next 10 years. I think I've graduated beyond the pasta sauce by this stage, but it was a big part of my life.
Being Welsh, what was in the? I'm sort of thinking, what did he add? What was there a Welsh influence in this Italian tomato-based sauce?
I will say that he did cook a lot with leeks, but he didn't put the leeks into the tomato sauce. He would just cooking seemed like a science to me that was beyond me and that I would never be able to figure out because you either knew it or you didn't. And then just watching him, I just learned that you can kind of you don't have to measure, you can kind of experiment. If you have the rough idea of what you're doing, then you can improvise. And I think, seeing him cook various tomato sauces with the ingredients that he had on hand allowed me to understand that. And I'm not saying he was a great cook, but he helped me get my foot in the door. And I guess his tomato sauce was just, frying up some onions with some garlic, putting in some peppercorns, cooking down some tomatoes until they were mush. I mean, he opened my eyes to peeled plum tomatoes from the can, which I would never go to the supermarket and consider buying a can of peeled tomatoes. I didn't even know why you should want the ones that were peeled rather than the ones that had their. That hadn't occurred to me. So we're talking very basic stuff here, but it made a big impression on me. You know, he would chuck capers in there sometimes if he had them. And then you can mix it literally with anything, like a can of tuna you could put in there. We're barely beyond student life at this point, you have to understand.
Was there a liberation once you discovered how food works and flavours develop?
Yeah. I mean, it changed my life. Literally. I mean, suddenly I got joy from cooking. And I could cook for other people. And I could, I don't know, seem so much more put together than a lot of my friends. Because I grew up in an Eastern European household.
And your parents did everything for you?
Well, your parents did everything for you, one, but also, you know, the kitchen wasn't a place for the boys. So they didn't teach you how to cook. Like cooking was something that women did. So I was completely left out of all the cooking. I didn't know what was going on. It was like a secret Alibaba's cave of mysteries over there, you know? So I thought that was really quite unfair looking back. And I think a lot of the girls and women watching might be like, well, it seems a little bit unfair to the women. But you know, I missed out on a you know, something that I really take a lot of joy from today.
We have a wonderful sense now of you discovering food. Now, how about you discovering reporting? What was it like being a rookie reporter?
Oof. It was at moments dark, but it was also really exciting. You know, I came up in a time in Russia as a reporter when Vladimir Putin had just come to power and when he had just started his extremely violent campaigns in the North Caucasus and in Dagestan and Chechnya in particular. And a consequence of those wars was the campaign of terrorism that people from the North Caucasus brought to the major cities of Russia. And so as a reporter in Moscow, part of my job, you know, was going to the latest bombing of a rock concert aftermath, or going to the aftermath of the Nordost theater siege, or in particular, the one that left the most sort of indelible mark on my memory was the Beslan school hostage taking that happened in North Ossetia in 2004, when a group of rebels / terrorists from Dagestan and Chechnya took a school hostage. I think something like, I'm going to let this siren pass.
It goes well with your stories.
Yeah, there was a fair bit of that then. But yeah, for those that don't remember, the Beslan school hostage taking was a horrific event in which I think 1,000 people were taken hostage, maybe 300 or 400 of whom died. And most of those were children. You know, we were there for when the bombs that were strung around the gymnasium that the children and teachers were being held in exploded. And it was such a powerful explosion that you could feel the shock wave, you know, I don't know, 100, 200, 300 meters away where we were posted outside the school behind the police lines. And you can imagine the aftermath of a series of powerful explosions happening in like a basketball court full of people. Like it was just, I mean, just blood and guts everywhere, basically. And when you're 23 years old and you see that sort of thing, maybe not for the first time, but on that scale for the first time, it impacts who you are. And it changes your outlook on the world, and it changes your outlook on life. I mean, I'll never forget, one of the soldiers or security officers running from the building, with the body of a child in his arms, who was mostly naked with her arm torn off and completely pallid, and clearly not going to survive. And I almost threw up on the spot, just like seeing that. And then in the days that followed, just going into the gymnasium, seeing the aftermath, speaking to the parents who'd lost their children day in and day out. And, to this day, it's kind of like not the gore that really gets you. It's afterwards talking to the people that have lost someone, that really makes you sad in a profound way, in a lasting way. That I think that, I stopped being like a rookie reporter very quickly, and I just kind of became it's taken me a long time to get past this dark view of the world, and I think I'm in a good place now. And I think I'm good at sort of balancing my work and separating my work and keeping like a Chinese wall between what I see at work and who I am at home. But in those early days, that was my entire personality. So it was a fascinating time. It was a dark time, but it certainly informed my view of Russia. And to this day, we don't know who set the bombs off in the gymnasium, because Putin has never negotiated with terrorists. That's always been a position of his, and he would rather take high casualties than enter into any kind of a negotiation. So there's still a theory unto this day that the security forces started the fighting, causing the terrorists to set the bombs off, because that's what they threatened to do if their demands weren't met.
Simon, with all this graphic violence and sadness, have you ever thought of choosing another career?
Oh, yeah, all the time. Are you kidding?
So why do you go back? Why do you keep going back to this thing that just keeps coming up for me is that truth, reporting on truth is really important to you. And so my next question is you were born a Russian Jew, and you have both American and Israeli citizenship. How does that mix of background influence the way you see the world and report on truth?
I've tried not to make my identities dictate my views on things as much as that is possible, because I come from kind of the three of the most hated groups out there. A lot of people don't like Russians. A lot of people don't like Jews. And, there's not a lot of love for America, particularly these days either. And it's been, even before the politics of today, America is one of the most powerful countries out there, has had its detractors. So I know walking into any situation that if somebody wanted to have a bias or a prejudice against me, they could just pick or choose. So I've never wanted to allow my concerns about what somebody might think about me because of who I am to get in the way of me doing what I want to do or going to the places that I want to go. But you also have to be sort of realistic and plan for various eventualities, which is how I ended up becoming an Israeli in my 30s, was because I was treading on pretty thin ice with Russia because of a lot of my reporting. And I didn't want to end up in a situation where I was banned from visiting, because you need a visa to visit Russia as an American citizen, but Israelis don't. And so I went to Israel and ended up living and reporting there for 3 years, but kind of initially the point was to get the citizenship so that I had a document that allowed me to continue to travel to Russia, where a lot of my family is from. And so it was kind of like an insurance policy for me. And it worked for a little while because I did eventually get banned from Russia, and they stopped issuing passports. And I visited Russia on my Israeli passport a number of times. I don't do that anymore because since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the situation in Russia itself has also changed dramatically. And it's become really dangerous to speak out in a way that the regime perceives as going against the propaganda and the ideology and the version of truth that they want to spread. So this isn't theoretical. This is very practical. There are laws against fakes about the army, which is what they call it, which essentially means if you say anything about the war in Ukraine or about the military's activities that goes against what the official line is, you are spreading fakes about the army, and you can go to prison for 5, 6, 7 years. And there are dozens and dozens of cases of this happening to people. And you don't have to be a journalist, although a lot of the people who do go to prison are journalists. You could literally post something on your Facebook profile that says that, Russia is the aggressor in the war in Ukraine and go to jail for a multiple year serious sentence. So, essentially all of my work from the perspective of Russian legislation over the last 3 years is, quote, spreading fakes about Ukraine. So I can never visit Russia again until the end of the Putin regime.
You've been covering the war in Ukraine since the annexation of the Crimea in 2014. You say, although you're not an activist, Ukraine's struggle for independence from Russia is important to you. Why?
I mean, it's frustrating that you even have to answer that question. You know what I mean?
I do.
But you do have to answer that question because a lot of people don't even understand that it is a struggle for independence. A lot of people see the war in Ukraine as a proxy war between the United States and Russia, and that the Ukrainians are caught in the middle, and that they have no agency in what has happened in their own country. And nothing could be further from the truth. The Ukrainians are the ones who, on a number of occasions over the last couple of decades, have flooded the central squares of their cities, demanding that corrupt leaders who are aligned with Russia step down, and that elections that have been stolen from them by manipulation be overturned. And they have put their own bodies and their own safety onto the front lines of these protest movements because they have chosen a path for themselves, whatever language they speak, whether they're Russian speaking or Ukrainian speaking, that is aligned with democracy and integration with the European Union. And when people say that it was NATO expansion into Eastern Europe that triggered Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they're missing out on the fact that actually the invasion and annexation of Crimea, which set this whole conflict off in the first place, began when the Ukrainian government was poised to sign a trade agreement with the European Union, not join NATO, but simply move closer to the European Union so that more of their goods could have access to the European market. That was enough for Vladimir Putin to draw a red line and say, no, it's not going to happen. I wanted Ukraine to be in the trade pact with Russia. They were supposed to join the Eurasian Union, not the European Union. And by the way, this was only going to be an incremental step towards joining the European Union, but it was enough for Vladimir Putin to send the little green men who have now become infamous into Crimea, and to, for the first time since the Second World War, start a war of aggression in which a chunk of territory is seized from a neighboring country and joined to another country. And so, this is the real struggle that we're dealing with. And if Putin is willing to do it in Ukraine, what's to stop him doing it somewhere else?
Do you have a sense of what most Russians feel about the war in Ukraine?
Not really. I mean, I think a lot of Russians don't feel that they can express their true feelings, because of what we talked about before, with it being punishable with prison sentences, to express a view that goes against the state line. But also I think a lot of Russians don't want to talk about it because it's difficult to admit that your country has committed one of the most horrific crimes against a people that until very recently were considered a brotherly people who were the closest group to Russians of any of the countries in the world. And to this day, the propaganda talks about the Ukrainians as a brotherly nation, with the left hand, while the right hand is out there killing Ukrainians. And so I think a lot of Russians want to sort of shut themselves off from this very grim reality. They don't want to confront the fact that their country, and perhaps they themselves in some way, are complicit to creating this reality. And then there's a very large chunk of the people who, because they want to get away from that realization, go to the other side of the argument and argue the same points that the government is arguing, because, again, that's easier. That's easier than admitting that you're wrong.
Do you think the idea of determinism, the belief that war's outcome is already decided, plays a role in how Russians or Ukrainians see the conflict?
Well, I think there's a lot of determinism on both sides. There's determinism here in the West and there's determinism here in Russia. And time again, the Ukrainians have proved both wrong. Russia launched this war as a 3-day operation, that they were going to sweep into Kyiv and they were going to decapitate the leadership. And they were going to create facts on the ground that the West was going to have to confront and just deal with a resurgent Russia that now controls, one of the largest countries in Europe by landmass. That didn't happen. The Ukrainians have been fighting bravely since 2022, and recently the Institute for the Study of War here in Washington, D.C., put out a number that said if the Russians continue their incremental gains at the rate that they're conquering Ukrainian territory right now, it'll take them 80 years to get to the Polish border. So do I think that the Russians have the resources, the manpower, the will to keep fighting for another 80 years to get to NATO's border at Poland? I don't. I don't think there's determinism there. But I do think, so I don't think that the war's outcome is predetermined. I do think that the Russians want everybody to believe that because when you look at the map of Russia, it's so much bigger than Ukraine that there's only one outcome that we could happen. And everything they talk about is made to make us think that. But we actually, as the West and Ukrainians, as a country, have a lot of agency and potential and possibility in making that outcome not come to pass.
Well, we're here to talk about your food memories. Let's move on to the last one.
Okay.
Which is the Frito pie. What the hell is a Frito pie?
I love how you pronounce it. The Frito pie. The Frito pie. It's a Frito pie.
Yeah. It depends on where on the island I am. Where is the Frito pie from?
Do you guys have Fritos in Australia? They're like,
we do, but we probably don't call them Fritos.
What do you call them?
Fritos. I don't know. So are we talking like a fried? It's clearly fried, like a fried pizza.
No. Oh my God, you have no idea.
So this
We're
is
like
why I
coming-
have you on the show,
Yeah.
Simon.
So, like Fritos are like a chip, like corn chips. They're kind of like tortilla chips that are cut into. They're made out of corn, and they're cut into little strips, and they're seasoned with something spicy, and they are packaged into these little bags, and you can literally find them at every single gas station.
Like corn, are we talking corn chips?
Yeah, like tortilla chips, but tortilla chips are triangular.
Oh,
these-
we have those.
Yeah, these aren't triangular, but they're made out of the same stuff. But they have also a lot of sort of like gross fast food chemicals on them. They're strips. They're kind of curled strips made out of tortilla kind of corn, and they're a sort of very American take on a tortilla. And the Frito pie is when you open up this bag of chips and you put it in the middle of the table where you're drinking with your buddies, and they dump a bunch of like chili on top of it. And if you're lucky, you get some sour cream. So like beef chili, spicy beef chili, you just dump it on top of these chips, and it's in an open spread bag. And then you're just like kind of eating it like nachos. It's like a poor man's nachos, basically. Right. And I had just moved to New York from Israel, where I had been freelancing. And Vice Media hired me to work on the second season of their HBO show. And the guy who hired me took me to the bar next door, which I think is called Mabel's. And it's got like a sort of Texas kind of country western aesthetic going on. And he ordered me a Frito pie. And I was like, ooh, I am not in Kansas anymore.
Dorothy.
Actually, maybe I am in Kansas. That's exactly where I am. I'm in Kansas. And he proceeded to just sort of like initiate me into what was going on at Vice, which was a company that I didn't know very much about, which had an outsized reputation that I wasn't aware of because I hadn't lived in the United States since 1998.
They were a guerrilla news kind of punky thing, weren't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you didn't shop at American Apparel in like the noughts, then and you were my age, you had no idea what Vice was, because they distributed the magazine. It started out as a magazine at these stores. I think that was like the first place that it appeared for free. You could pick it up, and yeah, it was like, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That was kind of their thing. And by the time they brought me in, they'd kind of grown into this video media streaming organization that was trying to get into news. And they were also trying to get a little bit more serious. But they brought all their original fans who were there with them from the sex, drugs, and drugs days to the present, which was 2013 for me when I joined up. And those people started watching the news, so we had to give them the news in kind of a different flavor. And it was really successful. And it was kind of like the hottest thing out there, the most popular news channel on YouTube at the time. And there was a period when, you know, the BBCs of the world were trying to imitate what Vice was doing because they wanted to attract the young audiences that Vice owned. They called Vice the hipster Bible at the time, back when hipsters were a big deal. And I was sort of thrust into that with the Frito pie, which isn't a pie at all.
No. What other favorite American meals do you have?
Oh, I love hamburgers. I love pizza. I mean, who doesn't like pizza? I love like actual pies, not the Frito pie, but like an apple pie with ice cream, which I think they call a la mode, is one of my favorite guilty pleasures. To go to a diner, you know, like a 24-hour diner that we have here in the States, and sit down and just like pig out on an apple pie with ice cream. I love that.
It sounds like heaven. You've chosen St. Javelin as your social cause. Who are they?
St. Javelin is this incredible nonprofit in Canada that has become, since the full-scale invasion, a fully fledged clothing brand in a lot of ways. But they started out by selling stickers of this icon, I think of a saint or Mary, it's kind of unspecified, holding a javelin, which is an anti-tank weapon, which was critical in Ukraine's defense at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. It's a weapon provided to Ukraine by the United States. And so it's like this picture of a saint holding this weapon. And this guy, Christian Boris, who founded St. Javelin, he's a Ukrainian-Canadian. He used to be a journalist, and I know him from Ukraine. Just started selling these stickers for $10 or $20 a piece in order to raise money for Ukraine at this time when the Russian tanks had just rolled across the border. And I remember him being in my DMs and like sending me screenshots from the sort of Google widget that shows you how much money people have donated or how many stickers people have purchased. And like the first day he sent me a screenshot and it was like $50,000, and it was like he was over the moon. He'd never expected that he would make $50,000 to donate to Ukraine. 2 days later it was like 300,000. Then it was $500,000. Then it was $1 million. At one point he had $2 million that people had just sent him over the course of several weeks. He didn't even have enough stickers to send to these people. He had to send messages around to be like, listen, you guys are going to have to wait for your stickers. That's how much enthusiasm there was for finding ways to support Ukraine in those early weeks. And I was just so proud of what he did. And like I said, now it's grown from selling stickers to selling like really cool hoodies and all kinds of other like accessories that actually look good and are made to a really high quality standard and are all made in Ukraine, by the way. You know, I want to inspire some of that enthusiasm for the support for Ukraine that we had in the early days, because it's still just as needed as it was then, if not more. And so that's why I chose St. Javelin as my social cause.
We have an MFK Fisher Serve It Forth tradition here at TFM, where our previous guest presents you with a dish. Jamie Jury, Australia's celebrated garden designer, presents you with a Sri Lankan fish curry.
Ooh.
Oh, you're happy about that? Yeah, that was a big
curry,
thumbs up.
And I love fish. Thank you. Is he going to mail me this thing?
We can arrange it. We'll send him a photo of him holding it.
Amazing.
It's very easy on the eye, the young Jamie. Now, what would you like to serve forward to our next guest?
I did just make some Japanese curry to continue on. Listen, don't knock it. Don't knock it.
I'm not. I'm
just because it comes
observing.
from a packet doesn't mean it's not going to be the meal of your dreams. I'm all about simple foods. But how about some fried pierogi? You know,
fried pierogi,
just to keep it local.
I think that might go down well. Our next guest is Blanche Delpugette, who was the wife of legendary Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke.
Well, I hope she enjoys the pierogi.
I think she'll enjoy looking at photos of you, first of all. One final question for you. You said you thought of changing your career multiple times. What would you have done if you weren't a journalist?
Probably rock star, you know, obviously. I mean, if you're a journalist, you've certainly got a deep hole of some kind to fill in terms of attention seeking. So it'd have to be one of those careers, you know, where you're out there in front. Yeah, I don't know. The problem is that every time I've considered becoming something else, I've realized that I don't know how to do anything else.
Thank you, Simon, for your fearless energy and open ears, eyes and heart. And please stay safe.
Sawa, thank you so much. I love this conversation. Be well.
That's it for this episode of 3 Food Memories. Be sure to share the plated love and check out our 80-plus back episodes. They're still as delicious as they were when they were freshly rolled. For all things TFM, head to the socials at 3 Food Memories. For more info and to send us a message, head to 3foodmemories.com. 3 Food Memories is edited by Lauren McWhirter with original music by Russell Torrance. Nasta kalafili and bye for now.
Thank you for listening to Papa's